Hello, and welcome to Keep the Channel Open. My name is Mike Sakasagawa, and this is episode 33. Today's guest is José Olivarez, poet and co-host of the Poetry Gods podcast. Now, I was very excited to get the chance to talk to José because, and I don't say this lightly, the Poetry Gods is my absolute favorite podcast, hands down. I first started listening last spring, and I was just immediately hooked. And I'll just say it's one of the few shows that I will drop everything to listen to as soon as a new podcast episode drops. The three hosts, Jose, John Sands, and Aziza Barnes, they have this really amazing rapport. And every episode, they and their guests, they have these conversations that are just every time funny, warm and insightful and profound. And what's more, they introduced me to a whole bunch of poets I didn't know before, including their own work, which I also love. So rather than having a big long monologue this week, I want to just jump right in. First thing, though, I wanted to mention that the second season of the Poetry Gods is going to be premiering on February 28th with guest Tim Sybils. So if you are not already subscribed to that, you definitely want to check that out. I put a link for that in the show notes. And then also, Jose is teaching a 5-week online workshop with the Adirondack Center for Writing, which is called Make It Sing, Writing Poetry Out of the Everyday. And registration for that course is open now, and it runs from February 27th to March 27th, and I put a link in the show notes for that as well. Okay, so let's get into the show. Here's my conversation with José Olivarez. Yeah, I'm really looking forward to this conversation ever since I first reached out to you, and I know you know this because I've said this to you like a million times, but I really feel like the Poetry Gods, your podcast, the Poetry Gods, is the best thing on the internet. It is absolutely my favorite show.
That is, I mean, and you have said that. It's still, very cool to hear. And also, to be frank, a little bit surprising considering that when John, Aziza, and I sort of started recording the podcast, we expected that maybe 5 people would listen to it. We were like, maybe our closest friends and maybe one person besides that will listen to it. So the fact that people have been tuning in has been really cool, but still definitely surprising, I think.
Yeah. I mean, I can understand that, but then at the same time, it's just the three of you do is so, it's just so engaging, and it's so, real, that it really draws you in. And I was just hooked from the first episode. I don't even know, I can't even remember where I heard about it the first time.
Yeah, that's what I'm curious about. How did you hear about it?
Well, I mean, I follow a bunch of poets on Twitter, okay. So most likely one of them must have seen it and retweeted it.
Okay.
And I think I started listening around maybe the 3rd episode, and then went back and listened to the first 2.
Okay.
Yeah, but I mean, I really every time a new episode would drop, I would just I'd move it to the front of the queue. I mean, I'm subscribed to like 40 podcasts.
Wow.
But I always, some of them sit around for a while, but I always would make time for the Poetry Gods just because it just always really lifted my day. And it sounds, I think the main thing too is that the three of you always just sound like you're having such a good time.
Yeah.
And getting to have that in your ears for an hour, every so often is just, it's a real bright spot.
Yeah, for sure. I mean, recording the podcast is a lot of fun. Most of the time, I'd say all except maybe 3 episodes we record in person. Mm-hmm. So, the ritual sort of leading up to the moment we press record is, we'll share a little bit of drink, we'll eat some hummus, we'll, very quickly run down the format of the show for whoever the guest is. And, usually by the time we hit record, there have already been 4 or 5 things said that we're like, oh man, I wish we were recording already. That was really funny, or that was really insightful, or whatever. Mm-hmm. So anytime I hang out with Aziza and John, it feels like we had a conversation, maybe a couple weeks ago where we were, starting to make plans for the next season, and it, that conversation felt like it belonged on the podcast. Like, I think the three of us just kind of naturally have this rhythm to our friendship that, for whatever reason, makes it, very, very easy and listenable and something that translates well, to other people.
Yeah. Yeah. The rapport that the three of you have with each other and with your guests, for that matter, is really, it's very natural, and it's just, so energetic. The three of you are all always so fun and funny, but also really insightful. And then you're so engaged with your own practices, and there's something about listening to artists and writers who know why they're doing what they're doing, that I always just find just so wonderful. Now,
yeah, thank you.
Yeah, well, how did the three of you meet?
John, Aziza, and I met. So I met John in Chicago probably in like 2012, 2013, but we didn't talk much. He was, kind of touring a little bit. I think that was not too long after his book came out, The New Clean. And so he performed at Young Chicago Authors, which is the organization that I was working for at the time. And then when I moved to New York in the summer of 2013. And when I moved to New York, I reached out to a bunch of people that I had met, and, didn't really expect much of a response. I mean, I kind of knew a couple people, but, I didn't expect to be invited to readings, or, I was a newcomer. I was a stranger. And John was one of the people that immediately started inviting me to different events. So anytime John invited me to something, I would go. If he invited me, there was a group of poets, of male poets that would get together to talk about masculinity, to talk about particularly toxic masculinity, sexual violence and sexual assault is an issue that is really kind of an epidemic in the poetry community. And so there was a group of men that kind of started organizing to have these broader conversations with as many men as possible in the community to talk about masculinity and, to talk about sexual violence too, but also really just to have honest conversations about masculinity and where we were at with each other. And so that was really how I got to know John, because there were maybe a group of probably 6 or 7 of us that were present at all, or, the vast majority of those conversations. And then Aziza I met kind of randomly. I met Aziza in 2014 after my book had come out, the book I wrote with Ben Alfaro, Home Court. I got invited to perform at Rikers Island for a women's group through the organization Voices Unbroken. And Aziza was also invited to be a guest and to perform. So while we were waiting to go through the process to get into the prison to perform at Rikers, Aziza saw me kind of flipping through my book and trying to figure out what poems to read. And Aziza was like, oh my God, I've looked at that book. That book, my friend Jason Smith, who, would later become the first guest on the Poetry Gods, my friend Jason, was showing it to me earlier. And so Aziza and I started talking, and I had seen Aziza read before. Aziza had a book release and was invited to be a part of the Green Light Poetry Salon. So I had seen Aziza read from their first chapbook. So I was really excited. And from that point, the three of us really came together when we all were working for Lincoln Center for the Poet Link program. So this was a program, Lincoln Center kind of hired me to manage it, and The first two people that I reached out to were Aziza and John to sort of facilitate this program for high school students in New York City. And immediately, the rapport was kind of there. We would get together in theory to lesson plan, and we would end up, for the first hour and a half of whatever session we were in, we would end up YouTubing T-Pain videos or like looking up, comedy clips. And like that was all fun and well, but really that kind of like making like relationship building with each other became sort of the center of the work we did in the classroom. And so what I mean by that is, for example, we became obsessed with this video of Jamie Foxx completely roasting and kind of destroying this comedian named Doug Williams. Have you seen this?
Yeah.
Yeah, it's hilarious. It's still one of my favorite clips on YouTube. And so we became obsessed with it, and we started asking questions. We were like, well, where's Doug Williams now? And at the time, we were very sympathetic towards Doug Williams. We were like, oh, Doug Williams was an amateur comedian. He was just trying to get his big break. And, Jamie Foxx, the big, bad professional comedian, just kind of like takes it to him for no reason. And then we looked up Doug Williams, and Doug Williams is, but is like actively not funny. He's not a good comedian. And even worse, like his jokes are like they're not, they're unfunny and they're sexist. Like they fall into like, he did this whole set about how he's very happily married. And then he, the punchline was that his wife is a warden. You know what I mean? Like, it's very, we listened to that and we were like, Doug Williams does not deserve our sympathy. Doug Williams is, is a villain, is not a victim. So anyway, all that to say that we took this clip that we were obsessed with and we would make the work revolve around our obsession. So all three of us kind of have this, I think, flexibility and ability to take the parts of the world that for whatever reason, whether it's, a clip of Doug Williams or if it's, we did a lesson plan using the T-Pain Tiny Desk concert that he did for NPR. To take these small obsessions and to build actual curriculum and work around them. And we just had a lot of fun. Like we had so much fun together. I think the young people that we worked with there like really built a tight-knit community. And I think part of it is because they could feel it amongst the three of us. I think that they could sense that we really liked being with each other and we really liked being with them. And they kind of like carried that through. So, from that moment on, Aziza and John and I became very tight.
Yeah. There's so much of the stuff that you were just saying in there that was was making me think just so much about community and how important that is. Like when you first come to a new city or a new area, especially when you're young or at least young creatively. That I know when I first came to San Diego, I didn't really know a whole lot of people in the arts community here, but one of the things that's always been really kind of surprising to me in a good way is how generous everyone has been with their time and with their willingness to bring people in and sort of show people the ropes and introduce people. And when there's really nobody owes me anything, but the way that people have been so willing to sort of pay forward whatever good things have happened to them. It's such a valuable thing. And, for me, it's something that I try to do now for other people as well. But, hearing you talk about John bringing you in, it was making me think of that.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Absolutely.
Yeah. And, the stuff that you were saying about toxic masculinity, that's one of those things that, like, I think when I was first starting out, that I'm a photographer and I also write, but I think when I was first sort of getting into photography, which was about maybe 6, 7 years ago, I was sort of surprised that like even in the fine art world, like you sort of hear things about photojournalist culture, but like even in the fine art world, I was sort of surprised at how many sort of photo bros there are.
Mm-hmm.
And there's definitely a lot of sexism in that, and I wouldn't have thought that that would have been the case, but it really is true. And it's the same thing, hearing you talk about the poetry community, that I wouldn't have thought poetry is it's an art form that requires so much honesty and vulnerability and sort of self-awareness to be able to do it well. You wouldn't think that that's the kind of thing the kind of environment that toxic masculinity could really live in. But
yeah, well, that's the thing. I think that for so long, I think it was just kind of assumed that the poetry environment was safe to begin with, and therefore, we wouldn't deal with the same issues that society at large built. You know what I mean? Like that because we were artists and we were coming to the table, not necessarily for money, although there is a little bit of money, but for the sake of like trying to find honesty within yourself, that it wouldn't be an issue. And I think because that, I think one, like, no matter how utopic the vision is for an artistic community, and I think that at times, I've been certainly in poetry gatherings that have felt very utopic, where I've been like, the world at large is very fucked up, but like this room right here of these 15 people or these 10 people or whoever is, absolutely beautiful and safe and vulnerable in all the best ways. But poetry, one, we still have to live in the world. And so we're still, we can't live in that space, in that moment 24/7. And so we, and even, I think about all of the ways that violence was rooted in me, you know what I mean? Mm-hmm. And I had to learn to face, and I'm still learning to face those particular ways, even now. I mean, just today I was on Twitter, which is one of my favorite things, as you know. And the poet Kava, Akbar was talking about how today was World Brow Day, and was making a case that poets, and everyone really should not use ableist language. You should not sort of use the ideas of blindness or deafness to put forth an image in a poem, because that's someone's real lived experience. And I remember reading that this morning and being like, I really, I have not actively been trying to root this out. This might be something that I have in my poetry, and I want to, but you have to like want to, and you have to be able to listen when people are telling you that violence is rooted into you, and you have to be willing to look at yourself. And it's not always easy, particularly if you are in this environment where everyone is telling you how great you are and how wonderful your poem is, and how down you are with the cause and the movement, and how not like those other dudes you are. It can be very easy, I think, to start to turn a blind eye to like the fact that none of us will ever be perfect, and so we kind of have to continue always to be diligent and aware of ourselves and the way that we move in the world. And and for me now, what I mean, I think about it in terms of like, now I have a little bit of an opportunity as a poet, as a community member, and as someone who, from time to time is asked to curate events, or, is asked to teach in workshops. I think about like, how am I representing, how do I bring everyone in? How do I make sure that I'm not just opening the door to young men, but that I'm opening the door to young people of all genders, right? How do I like continue to have to try and articulate that to myself and really hold myself accountable? Because if not, I think it's a practice, and if not, then it just doesn't happen, and it's very easy to be like, oh well, it was a mistake, but it wasn't. It didn't need to be a mistake. We can do better. We can sort of seek those things out.
Yeah,
that makes sense.
Yeah, I think that's that kind of thing. Being willing to examine one's own complicity, is like one of the hardest things to do, and especially for people who are already themselves marginalized along some other axis.
Yeah.
That you can get so used to thinking of yourself as, not having power in those ways that you can kind of forget that in other ways you are on the powerful side of it, and you are the kind of you can participate in oppressing other people. It's really hard to recognize that, but yeah, you're right. We can if we're willing to get uncomfortable a little bit. But I mean, sometimes it seems like it's hard to, I'm always impressed when people can do it. I wish I could figure out how to get people to do it,
Yeah, yeah. And I mean, I don't know, I don't know about that. But, the more that I think about it, the more that I'm like, of course, the art world and, the poetry world, of course there's sexism and violence rooted in all of these art forms. I mean, if you just have to take a look at the canon and you see, the way that artists are, particularly male artists are looking at women and depicting the female body, you know what I mean?
Yeah.
The women's body. Like, it just, if I think about it long enough, I'm like, of course we're not creating utopia. You know what I mean? Like, we strive towards utopia, but of course we are flawed in the same ways that all people are, and in the same ways that, we still are a part of the world.
Yeah.
Yeah.
Yeah, absolutely. And it's, sexism and racism and all those other forms of bigotry and oppression are just, they're the water that we swim in. So it's you can't get away from it, even sometimes when you think you are. So I wanna talk a little bit about your own work, because I got to know you or know of you because of the Poetry Gods and getting to hear all your thoughts and stuff like that. But that's what led me to reading your own poetry, and as impressive as much as I love your podcast, I love your poetry even more. And one thing that always strikes me about your poems, I haven't obviously read all of them, but I've read a bunch at this point, and there's such a strong current of, like you mentioned, other people's lived experience just a minute ago, and that's something that I guess all poetry in some ways has to do with people's experience, but it's something that's very, I can't think of the right word, but your all of your poems seem very rooted in your experience, and they're so personal and honest and authentic. There's so much in there about recognizing who you are and who you want to be and who you've pretended to be in the past, that kind of thing. It's very powerful to me. All that stuff, it really hits me right where I live. I think a lot of these things are things that a lot of us sort of struggle with as men or just as people. But there's something about being able to see these sort of feelings in other people's work that it really, when you get to see that, it moves something in you.
Yeah. Thank you.
So you're from Calumet City, Illinois. I know that.
Yeah.
You've written about sort of a lot of your poems are talk about your experience growing up as a Mexican boy in Illinois and what that was like. I'm sort of curious, like how did you discover poetry? I mean, I guess that's kind of like a prosaic question, but I mean, I'm curious.
Yeah, absolutely. Please ask whatever you have on your mind. In terms of how I discovered poetry, I remember the first poems I read were a part of the school curriculum, and it wasn't particularly interesting to me. Poetry didn't really become interesting to me until I got involved with the poetry slam team at my high school. So I was very lucky in a number of ways. The youth poetry community in Chicago is kind of centered around a poetry festival called Louder Than a Bomb. And because Louder Than a Bomb is a team festival as opposed to an individual festival, schools, would create these poetry clubs and would have teams, and those teams would kind of throughout the year build their poems together and build group pieces and work together to try and facilitate growth as poets. At the time that I was in high school, this is back in like 2005, 2006, there were only 40 teams that competed in Louder Than a Bomb. So I was lucky enough that I went to one of the schools that participated in Louder Than a Bomb. I went to a school that had a poetry slam team, and so it was an activity that I signed up for it after school, and I don't think that I would have signed up for it if it wasn't for the fact that before poetry, I really had this very narrow conception of myself. I was a Mexican son, and I was the son of Mexican immigrants, and so I kind of understood my job to be very quiet, to be to sort of just listen and pay attention and follow directions, because the most important thing was that I graduate from high school, that I go to college, that I get, good enough grades that I can go to law school or go to, to med school so I could study to become a lawyer or a doctor, so I could make enough money that I could take care of my whole family, right? And that was how I understood the entirety of my identity from the time I was in middle school. I knew that I had to do this and that there wasn't really a ton of wiggle room.
That's a heavy thing to have to know when you're that young.
Yeah, I mean, it was there's multiple sides to that. On one hand, it was the fire that kind of propelled me. So on one hand, it was, my mom always told me we came to this country so you and your brothers could get educated and we've made a lot of sacrifices for you. And so I kind of understood that not just as a burden, but as a great privilege. I was the one who got to have the opportunities, right? I was the one that got to make good. And so it didn't necessarily feel like a burden at all times, but it did feel like my path was predetermined. My mom and dad came to the United States, and so therefore I had to, they kind of alley-ooped it up to me, and I had to follow through and make good, right? Mm-hmm. And also because my parents are immigrants, I grew up very fearful of the law and authority and all of those things. And so when I was in school, I was very quiet. Even when I knew the answers, I didn't raise my hands. One of my friends, Joe, he tells a story about we were in math class and, we were sitting in groups and the teacher asked a question and I answered the question and the teacher didn't hear me. So the teacher was like, nobody knows the answer to this question. And then Joe, being kind of like the smart ass that he was like, the answer is 2.5, right? Like real loud. And the teacher was like, well done. Like, how did you get that? And he was like, it wasn't really me. Jose said it. You just couldn't hear him. He said it too quietly. And that was, even when I thought I was speaking up, I was, barely speaking above a whisper. I don't know if I was taught, but at some point I learned that the easiest way to make it through would be to like be as quiet as possible, to go as unnoticed as possible, right? And so poetry and poetry slam in particular was the first time that I saw adults listening to teenagers. It was the first time that, I saw my peers, my friends talking about their lives. So it was the first time that I was like, oh, this world that I've been living in, Calumet City, and my parents' experiences and what it's like to be Mexican. Like my whole life and my world is worthy enough to belong in a poem. Like it didn't, I never, it always seemed to me that books was something that happened in castles. It was something that happened in England. It didn't seem like something that happened in like a small working class steel, suburb of Chicago. And so when I started to see myself not just when I poetry was what helped me see myself as someone who could not just listen to the story, who was not there just to read as many books as possible, but who could potentially have a couple books to contribute, right? Who could potentially write and render this world that I was growing up in, and that might be interesting and compelling to the world outside of that I might have a conversation. That's what ultimately got me hooked. It was like it. I don't know if I can even articulate it, but it changed how I saw myself, from someone who was like kind of born to be the immigrant son, right, and didn't have a choice in that, to someone who could say, well, like this is, my parents have made their choices and I can make my own choices. It completely changed my relationship to the world.
Yeah. I mean, I can relate to that. It's something that, that thing about growing up and feeling like you're supposed to make yourself small and unnoticed is, I mean, that's a real common part of a lot of Asian American experience. And being able to come to a point, whether it's, in high school or later in life, like for me, like being able to come to a place where you find your own voice and find power in that voice it is a life-altering thing. It really does change a lot about how you think about everything. Yeah, it's pretty amazing.
Yeah. For you, was it also art and photography, or for you, what sort of, how did you come to that point?
It's funny. I never really had much in the way of training. When I was in high school, I started doing theater, just school theater. And I remember my grandma came and saw the first performance that I did, and she after the show she kind of looked at me and gave me this look by the stage door and was like, "I thought you were shy." And from there I did music. I did chorus, choir, and but it wasn't, the thing about those were, it was, performance is thrilling. And it's definitely an art form. It wasn't really something that for me was exactly creative. It wasn't really my voice, because it was always somebody else's music or somebody else's words. So it wasn't really until, I wrote a lot of bad, terrible poetry in high school.
Yes.
I think that's something that you'll kind of have to get out of your system.
Yeah. Listen, I've written the worst poems. Continue to write terrible poems. Like I have a terrible poem open on my computer right now.
Yeah.
But that's, everyone kind of goes through that.
Yeah. For me, I think, I put my, a lot of my creativity aside, in college and in my early adulthood. I'm 37 now,
Mm-hmm.
and it wasn't until I was in my 30s that I really started really engaging with the art world and art community and my own art voice.
Mm-hmm.
But for me, it was sort of having kids that
Mm.
really did it for me. When my son
When
was
did
born,
when did you have your first kid?
I was 29 when
Okay.
my son was born, and I have three kids now. They're 8, 5,
Okay.
and 2. And it was one of those things. My wife got me a camera because she knew I liked photography. I took one semester of photography when I was in high school, my
Uh-huh.
freshman year of high school, and then I
Yeah.
just sort of put it aside for 15 years. But she knew I
Wow.
liked it. She bought me a nice camera for my birthday, which was like a month before our son was born, and I just
Wow.
started tinkering with it. And then I just started learning. I started thinking, "Well, what if I could do something with this?" And
Yeah.
I'm still definitely in the emerging category, but just the ability to be able to, see something or feel something and then try and communicate that to someone else, it's a very powerful thing. I still feel
Mm.
small a lot, but, any connections
Yeah.
that I've been able to make they mean so much.
Mm. Yeah, yeah, absolutely. I hear that. So I'm about to turn 29 in a little over a month, in the
Mm,
middle of February. So I guess, I hearing that, you had your first son when you were 29, you know, I'm I'm really excited about getting older, and I'm really excited about, uh, I just feel like I have so much more to learn. So I'm really excited to be talking to you because I feel like, you I don't know how to put it, but I mean, for example, like I see you post about your kids, and I'm so curious just because I think that's something that I want. You know what I mean? If I
mm,
may be so bold, like I think that's something that I want, and so I'm like curious about. And I also see you post about running, and that's something that's important to me. So I'm you're I, you're living a life that is very exciting and filled with potential for me. And a life that I'm like kind of envious in a way. You know what I mean? Like that I'm like I hope that I'm striving towards this in some ways.
I think it's funny, like we always sort of all, envy the things that we don't have. I mean, I guess if we did have them, we wouldn't have to envy them.
Mhm. Right, right.
But often my life feels very prosaic to me, but I do with it what I can.
Hmm.
I think that's probably how we all feel.
Hmm.
But I think one of the things and one of the reasons why I connect so strongly with your poetry is it's the same thing for me with my photography. Not everybody does this with photography or with visual arts, but for me, it's really about taking the experience of my life and making something that I can communicate some feeling to somebody else,
Hmm.
and it's the same exact thing that I see with your poetry, that you have these aspects of your life, these feelings in your life that
Yeah.
can be very intense, and no one would ever know that anybody felt that way other than themselves if we didn't have a way to communicate that.
Yeah.
And having that art process to be able to share those things, it's the most important thing in the world as far as I'm concerned.
Yeah. I mean, I just imagine. Well, one, like I remember when I was a teenager that I read tons of books, and certainly I saw myself in a lot of characters, and I also got to imagine myself in these, different worlds and different existences, and that was all terrific. But, I remember the first time that I read uh, a Mexican poet. I remember the first time that I, read a Latinx writer. You know what I mean? It
Hmm.
wasn't it wasn't until I was in college, and I didn't even know how badly I kind of like wanted and needed a mirror for myself. You know what I mean? Like how, and that, I've always loved books, and that was great. But the second I read Junot Diaz, I was like, I can't believe this is the first time that I'm reading about Dominican teenagers. You know what I mean?
Yeah.
And so for me, capturing my experience becomes real important, because I think that there is still an absence. There's still a lack, particularly when I think about Latinx writers. But I think it's why like the We Need Diverse Books movement resonates so clearly with me, because all of our lives are so large, and there's just so much more in the world than what we currently have. So for me, it's always a matter, like the moments that I'm most proud of in terms of my writing are when high school students or high school teachers reach out to me and they let me know that they've used my poem in one of their classes and that it resonated. That means the most to me, because when I was in high school, I didn't have that. And so I in part, what I'm trying to do when I'm writing is I'm trying to create the poems and the books that I could have used when I was a teenager.
Yeah. That thing about representation is so important. And, for me, I didn't even have that until I was 36. It wasn't until last year that I really read a book that I really fully saw aspects of myself I'd never seen before. The book that did it for me was it was a novel called Everything I Never Told You by Celeste Ng.
Okay.
And there was just stuff in there that I'd never seen in a book before, and I just felt it so strongly. There's something about not just the ability to allow other people to feel represented. I mean, I think that's really important, and for me, certainly very valuable. I think, too, there's something subversive about, like, one of the things I remember you talking about on the Poetry Gods was people sort of looking at you and taking what you look like, and that affects how they receive your work. Like, you would write a really tender love poem, and they would describe it to you as raw, or, and and that sucks. But also, like, I think there's something about, like, some of your poems are very raw. Like, some of them are like that. But then some of them, like this one that I was just rereading today, I Walk Into the Ocean, it's just the loveliest, tenderest thing. And, like, there's nothing in it that necessarily has to be racial about it, And I think that there's something very subversive about, having like an ethnic name attached to a poem that isn't about ethnicity, like saying, yeah, we feel this way too, I think that's also a very valuable thing,
Yeah, for sure. I hadn't looked at that poem in a while, and when you shared it today, I sort of went back to it, and that also, the other part of that poem is that I wrote it for the Wall Street Journal, which doesn't normally publish poems, and it was an ekphrastic poem. So they sent, we sort of got the assignment. I was part of, the Poets House Emerging Poetry Fellowship in 2016. And so the Wall Street Journal reached out to them, and they were like, do you have poets that would want to write about our summer lineup of dresses? And so part of the reason why I wanted to write this poem was because I was like, I've never written a poem for a dress before. And let me try, in part, it was also subversive to me in terms of gender, you know what I mean? To be like, but I hear you. Anyway, I hear you. I think that's important.
I could keep going on forever, but we probably need to get into the second segment pretty soon. Plus, I know it's real late on your side. I was wondering if you didn't mind, before we get into the second segment, would you mind reading something?
Yeah. So I chose out two poems. Can I tell like the listeners what the second segment is?
Yeah, I mean, I'll intro it when we get there.
Okay.
Yeah.
All right. So then I'll just say that I chose these two poems because I thought that they fit sort of what I came up with for the second segment. So all right, I'll start with with all right, I'm gonna start with this poem. This is called On the Day I Get the News. On the day I get the news, I eat curry and dump the white rice into the spicy stew. 3 days later, missing mi abuelita Jacinta, I walk into the Dominican spot on my block and order rice, beans, and chicken. My grandma is dead. All I have is a couple pictures of her, memories of the last time I saw her. Memories of the last time I saw her 6 years ago. I try to write down what I can remember, but I barely scratch the page. All I will ever have is fading pictures of my grandma. I want my grandma back to eat dinner with us. I want to know how her and mi abuelo fell in love. I want to drink whiskey with mi abuelita, but I'm the only one of my family living in New York. I eat rice everywhere I go. It's how I make home in a country that can't pronounce my name. Among all my people, meaning people who don't have a home to go back to, meaning people who eat rice. Did my grandma make the best rice? I don't know, but I fill my mouth with it. I'll never be home as long as I'm alive. My grandma is dead. Even if she's in heaven, there's another border between us. I'll never get my grandma back. All I can remember is her slow walk side to side, and that every time I saw her, she made rice.
Oh, man. Thank
you. So that's the first poem. And then here's the second poem. This is called Small Poem for What Delights Me, number 1. And it's for Erica. When you know I'm watching you, you wiggle your ass side to side just a little, just enough to send the geese on my arms bumping side to side with a jiggle in my eyes. You get the goose bumping, the gorillas on my chest stumping, a giggle of ass, you, the conductor in control. You make music out of a small shake. You make all the animals in me wild again. All the animals in me shake their cages to get closer to you.
Oh, man. Oh, thank you.
Thank you. Two very different poems.
Yeah. All right, we'll take a quick little break, and then we'll go and do the second segment. So for the second segment, I always ask my guests to bring a topic of their own. It can be anything that you want, whatever is on your mind, whatever you're thinking about right now. So what would you like to talk about?
All right, so on my mind at the moment are beginnings and endings. So a big thing that's happening for me at the moment, I mean, there's many kind of transitionings happening in my life right now. So one is one of my grandmas passed away a few days before the election. And it's my grandma Jacinta, my dad's mom, who lived in Mexico. And so I had family members who wanted to go to that funeral who, because of citizenship complications, could not attend, right? And then, a couple days after that, Donald Trump was elected. And so that's something that has been on my mind. And then, to sort of go in chronological order, I'm also I'm in like the honeymoon stages of this like very early relationship. And so that's something that has been bringing me a lot of joy and also kind of, I don't know if it's because I'm a poet or a sucker or all of the above, like something that I like can't stop talking about just everywhere all the time. And then on top of that, I'm very soon, it's January when we're talking. I think you were telling me that this will air in March or sometime around then, right?
It'll probably go out in February.
In February,
Yeah.
okay. So on January 29th, and I don't even know how I'm doing this yet, but on January 29th, I'm moving from New York City to Chicago, back home, to begin working at Young Chicago Authors as the marketing manager. I'm going to be living with one of my very best friends named Marshall. And so all of this is happening now, and that means that this relationship that is bringing me a lot of joy is also going to like very soon be a long distance relationship, and so I'm thinking a lot about beginnings and endings. Like there's a lot of like very joyful beginnings, and there's like also just a lot of transitions in my life right now, and so I'm in this space where like at any given moment I could be very joyful or very sad or kind of tense and nervous and kind of fluctuating between those two poles.
Yeah. Transition is always such a strange thing. And it's a fertile time. Transition creates sort of creative fertility because of the fact that transition is always an uncertain thing, right?
Mm-hmm.
I'm sorry to hear about your grandma. When you were saying that about the first thing that popped into my mind was, I was thinking about the day after the election and how my son is in third grade, and I take him, and my daughter's in my older daughter is in kindergarten. I take the two of them to school every morning, and the morning after the election, a bunch of kids in my son's class, they're all standing out on the blacktop lining up to get ready for the morning, and like two or three of them are, they're immigrants themselves, and a bunch of the other ones, have a lot of close immigrant family. We live in San Diego, so there's a lot of that's real common here, and these kids are 8 years old, and they're all saying, like this one kid was saying, I'm never going to be able to see my grandparents again because Trump's going to build a wall. And I don't know, it was just heartbreaking to have to hear that. These little kids. And it's funny because, a lot of people think kids don't know stuff, but they know. They're paying attention and they're taking it all in. There's something.
Yeah, for sure. So I think a week or a week and a half after the election, I was in Ann Arbor for Poetry Night in Ann Arbor. And in addition to that, I was also in Detroit teaching for Inside Out Literary Arts. And one of the things I was talking to my friend Ben Alfaro, who, I wrote Home Court with, one of the things that he was telling me was that one of the schools that contacted them, that reached out to them for poetry workshops, was a school that was just in trouble because someone filmed the cafeteria kind of erupting into a chorus of "Build That Wall." Some students on one side, some students were yelling it at the Mexican students or the Latinx students, and so. And so I had no idea that would happen. But also after the election, we opened up our office space at Urban Word and we welcomed in teenagers. And there were teenagers that came in and some of them wanted, the only thing they wanted was to talk about politics. And some of them just wanted to play Uno and kind of try and find a sense of joy again. It terrifies me, and it breaks my heart to hear that there were very young children thinking about the fact that they wouldn't be able, like already having to consider that they couldn't see their grandparents again. Um, yeah, that's heartbreaking. But I mean, of course, children and young people are paying attention to the world and absorbing information. You know, they're here, they're listening, they're taking it all in.
Yeah. Yeah. I mean, it's an uncertain time for everybody right now.
Mm,
I think a lot of us are sort of not really sure exactly how we feel, you know.
yeah.
And it's one of those things too where, and this, I guess, kind of similar to what you were just saying about the changes in your own life, where
Mm,
you can have these big, heavy things hanging over you, but then at the same time, you know, your normal everyday life still happens. And so, like, I still pick up my kids,
mm-hmm.
drop them off at school. I still get to put them to bed at night and listen to the good things that happen to their day. And, when they give me a hug, it makes me happy. And, sometimes it's weird to sort of be holding all of that in your head at the same time, these really opposite feelings, the things that can be completely joyous at the same time as having, fear and anxiety about the future. It's kind of hard to get your arms around sometimes.
Yeah. Did you read Hanif Willis Abdul Rakib published a piece in MTV News today about the new year and about revisiting, I can't remember the name of the record, but it's a punk album, and it's not Lester Bangs. I think that's the name of the writer he likes, but it's it's an article about trying to find optimism, and you know Hanif mentions that his therapist has asked him to try harder not to be a cynic, and in the article he writes that every time he, you know, examines his inner cynic, he finds another inner cynic underneath that one. Uh, and I, so I guess what I'm curious about, where you kind of find space for optimism and joy, particularly as a parent, you know what I mean? Because it's one thing for ourselves, but I think it's another thing to try and like convey and foster that in kids, you know?
Mm. I haven't read Hanif's new piece. I do try to keep up with his writing because he's pretty great.
Yeah, Hanif is excellent.
Yeah, I really like a lot of the stuff or pretty much everything I've read of his, I've just loved. So I will have to check that out. I think for me, where I find the most, how to put this, one of the things that has been sort of carrying me through this time is that what this has really done for me is really motivated me to get off my ass and do something. And I see, looking around, a lot of other people who are doing the same things.
Mm.
I'm a person who has always had very strong opinions, and I don't know if it's just because of being Asian or just my own personal temperament, but I've never been very outspoken about stuff before, and it's only been in the last few months that I am really taking steps towards becoming an activist.
Mm-hmm.
And I think that, for me, people are talking a lot about hope right now, and they're talking a lot about, whether or not it makes sense to have hope or what that even means. I think that, we definitely can't we can't be naive about stuff, like we can't, there was a quote I saw from Brain Pickings. There was something like, that hope without critical thinking is naivete, but critical thinking without hope is cynicism. And to me, seeing all these people, who are motivated and moving in the same direction as me, that does give me hope, and it does sort of help me believe that even though it's going to be hard, that there's still things that we can do and places we can stake out to fight. I look at my kids, and my son, has been he knows that January 20th is the inauguration.
Yeah.
And he's been, when it was New Year's Eve and we were over at our friend's house for their New Year's Eve party, he was not looking forward to the turning of the calendar. He's like, 2017 is not going to be a good year. And one of the things for me that I have to sort of try and find ways to not deny that feeling of his, because I share it.
Yeah.
But also to not allow him, and by extension allow myself, to fall into complete cynicism and despair.
Yeah.
It's tough, but I think there isn't really an alternative, you know?
Yeah. I hear that.
Yeah. Oh man, that poem that you just having those two poems back to back that you just read, it's one of those things where you can't having those two emotions at the same time. I mean, that's just like life right there, right?
Yeah, I felt very when I chose them. I was kind of pressed for time. I was, before hopping on this call with you, I was trying to revise a poem and also kind of watching the end of a basketball game the Chicago Bulls were playing. And so by the time the game was over and I had finished the poem, I was like, all right, I gotta get ready for this call. And so I wanted to pick two poems that kind of most starkly illustrated kind of the two places that I've been fluctuating between.
Mm-hmm.
And so it made sense in that, very quick moment to be like, yes, I'll read these poems together. And then when we got on the call and I looked at them, I was like, wait, I was like, why am I reading? Why? I don't know. One, I don't know which poem to read first. I don't know if it's better to like read the poem about my grandma first, or like, I was like, this doesn't make any sense. I should have thought this out a little bit more.
No, I thought it was great. No, I thought it really worked.
Word. I felt silly. I was like, this is kind of ridiculous.
But I mean, that's life, right? Like, life is all of that stuff happening all at the same time. You don't get to control all of it, right? It just happens.
Yeah.
And do you kind of feel like there's something about when you're having these intense experiences and you're going back and forth, it's like having them next to each other makes each one stand out all the more in contrast, you know?
Yeah. I guess for me, my goal is, my main goal is to not become numb. Like I want to be in a place where I can feel hurt, where hurt doesn't have, zero impact on me, but where it can kind of shake me up. And I want to, because I think that the capacity to feel hurt is tied in some ways to my capacity to feel joy. Like, I don't think that I can like turn off my hurt sensors and leave on my joy sensors. You know what I'm saying? And so I think that you're right. I think that it does, one kind of helps, the lows of one kind of helps and gives texture to the other one. The other thing that I think about is, and I've been thinking about this a lot, I got to be a part of the Chicago Poetry Incubator this past year in 2016. And one of the faculty members was Patricia Smith. And Patricia's an incredible poet. But one of the things that she mentioned in her craft talk was about the difficulty of writing about trauma and about or pain or really anything, right? But particularly subjects that are very filled with emotion. Because there can be a tendency to write it too straightforward, right? And so if you're sad, it can be very easy to just write it the sad way. But so one of the things that Patricia said was that, Patricia said you need a light to enter a dark room. And so that's something that I've been thinking about how, you need contrast, and about how a light can help illuminate just how dark a room is, if that makes sense.
Yeah. I always have a hard time, when I'm trying to make something, whether it's a photograph or whether I'm trying to write something, I find that even if it's not, it's hard for me to write about an emotion that I'm not in the middle of, but it's also hard for me to finish writing about something and still be feeling it in the same way. Like the act of writing it transforms the emotion.
Yeah, I feel that. I hear that. I think, I don't know if I actually, now that I'm thinking about it, it makes sense hearing you say that. I don't know that I have the same relationship to writing. I think, well, one, I know that for me, it's much easier to write with some distance from the event, just because right after, like when I'm in the middle of experiencing an emotion, like I said, I'm a sucker. So it's hard for me to exit my emotional brain. I can paint the emotional image, or I can start to like conjure some language for how I'm feeling. But it's not until I have a little bit of distance that I can, unless I get really lucky, but usually it's not until I have a little bit of distance that I can go back and kind of rework and kind of add contours and different angles to the artwork than the first draft, if that makes sense.
Yeah.
But I think, even when I'm in the middle of it, like I wrote that poem, the second one that I shared, for this person in my life, and even after writing that poem, I want to write like 100 more. Like it doesn't, transform the feeling for me enough that I'm like, all right, now I've made this one poem. Now I can move on to like all the other things I want to write about. I still like very much am in, like I'm just in it, and I'm going to stay in it until, I don't know, but yeah. But
Yeah.
I hear you. I think that makes sense to me. I just think for me it's a little bit different.
Well, and as I'm thinking about it, one of the things that I was thinking about just when I was saying that is that I just, in October, I finished up a long-term project that I'd been working on, which is a photography and prose and poetry and bookbinding project.
Congratulations. That's awesome.
Thank you. And the whole thing is about nostalgia, and it's about, because, having moved away from my hometown and then coming back to it after everyone I know doesn't live there anymore, and having to sort of deal with that sort of haunted feeling. And, this project took me probably 5 years to do, and which is kind of surprising just insofar as it's not very long, the finished product, but when I'm thinking about it, I often, especially with photography, will start working in the middle of the emotion, especially because photography is something that, although there is a craft to it, can also be something that you do almost reflexively. I remember I went and visited my hometown just on a whim and started taking pictures without even really realizing what I was doing. But to your point, it wasn't until I'd sat with those pictures. I sat with those pictures for probably a year before I even realized that I could do anything with them. And it's only once I had a certain amount of distance from it that I was able to really engage with the craft of it. Because craft involves technique, and technique has to involve, intention, that it's hard to do that when you're wrapped up in the moment. So, for me, this working on this project, whether it was, revisiting, taking more pictures or editing the pictures or, doing the writing. By the time I was 5 years out, I definitely didn't feel the same acuteness. Like the emotion is still, the underlying emotion is still there. The loss is still there, but it's not acute anymore. And having, for me, it was really, in a lot of ways, spending the time with these photographs and sort of laboring over the words that I wanted to use to shape how the photographs would be understood. It was that experience of really focusing in on the craft of it and sort of turning the emotion over and over and over in my mind that was the transformative thing, I think, and having the time to become intimately familiar with the emotion and examining it from every angle, that allowed it the transformation.
That makes sense. That's cool.
I wasn't, it's funny. I wasn't intending to spend quite so much time in this call talking about myself.
But for me, that's what makes most sense. I just, one, I get tired of hearing myself talk, and even, I'm like, damn, I talked so much during this conversation. It felt like I was rambling at times. So I'm glad that you're talking about, your kids and your family and also your own projects, because I'm also very curious. You know what I mean? I feel like in some ways I interact with you a lot, and I see some of what you're doing, but it's also very cool to me to get to hear a little bit more in depth about what you're up to and what you have going on,
Yeah, well, I feel exactly the same way. I'm really glad to have gotten the opportunity to talk to you. I feel like I could just keep talking to you forever, but I know it's late on your end. But before we wrap up, the last thing I always ask my guests is if there is one piece of art or literature that has meant something to you recently.
So, after the election, I started to sort of, I think you were talking about this. I started thinking about what I needed to do and what I wanted to do to prepare myself. And so one of the first things that I did was I reached out to a good friend of mine, Stephanie Cuevas, who's a PhD candidate at the Harvard Graduate School of Education. And so I was like, Stephanie, we need to do a book club of like radical Latinx literature. We need to read as many books as possible to understand kind of the richness of our culture, because it's certainly going to be threatened in the next 4 years. And so the first book that we picked is a book called Borderlands by Gloria Ansaldúa. It's a book that mixes Chicanx theory and history and religious history. There's a lot of passages about indigenous religions in Mexico and in Central America, alongside poems, and it sort of flows back and forth between English and Spanish. And so for me, that book has been really important as I seek to understand, like, not just where I come from, but also like where I want to go. And as I'm considering, how I want to get there, this book has been, part history book and part map. It sort of helped me kind of begin to map out where I want to head forward.
Wow. Well, I will have to check that out. I'll definitely put a link in the show notes so that people can find that kind of thing. I think a lot of us could do with, I think one of the most important things right now for a lot of us is being able to engage with different cultures, but also being able to find strength in our own cultures. And yeah, so I feel that.
Yeah. I was thinking about this when you were talking about optimism, and I was thinking about Hanif's piece. I think part of what really resonated with me about Hanif's piece on sort of optimism and lack of optimism is I think two things are very true for me. Like, it is very hard for me to imagine that, I don't want to use the word revolution, but that it's very hard for me to imagine the day when, like, we can create a more liberated and free and safe country and world. Like, when I think about, like, my kind of utopic vision for the country, and not even that, like, at this point, I mean, considering where we're headed, like, it's very hard for me to even conceive how we're going to protect Obamacare. You know what I mean? Like, It's very hard for me to conceive of, like, how we're going to hold on to, like, the small wins that we've gained. And so that's true for me. And at the same time, like, I think that the fight itself has meaning for me and gives meaning and strength to me and gives a type of optimism. And I think about, there's a writer from Uruguay, and I can never remember his name. Hold on, he wrote The Open Veins of Latin America. Have you ever read this book?
I haven't.
The Open Veins of Latin America is a really great book. But Eduardo Galeano is the name of the author.
Okay.
But he has this quote where he's like, people always ask me why I, like, kind of demand utopia and why I strive so much, like, why I'm always trying to walk towards utopia. Like, what's the purpose of walking towards utopia? And he says the purpose of walking towards utopia is just that. It's walking. It's taking steps, right? And so for me, there is a sense of hope and, I guess, a type of optimism, even if I don't necessarily, in my heart of hearts, believe that we'll get there, in taking those steps towards there, in fighting to take those steps towards, a better world, a safer, healthier world.
Yeah. To me, I think I was actually just talking to somebody about this, another writer on Twitter this afternoon. Her name's Kia Brown. And it was on a completely different topic. It was just about acceptances and rejections, creatively. And what I was saying, what I believe, I got my first rejection letter of the year yesterday, but to me, like, getting a rejection doesn't actually bother me, because to me, a rejection letter is just evidence that I made the attempt, and making the attempt is the only thing that I can actually control. Yeah. And so, like, basing my sense of success or self-worth on the outcome isn't really, it's not like a good idea, because I'm going to just feel like shit a lot if I do it that way. But if I base it on what I can control, then that's something that's better for me. With this, I feel like it's the same thing, right? It's like, to me, hope, you need to have hope, because if you have no hope, if you have absolutely no belief in the future or even in the struggle, then there's no reason to just not give up and die, Yeah. But that hope doesn't necessarily have to mean that you think that you're going to see, you're going to reach that utopia, but still that there's value in the attempt. Yeah.
Yeah, and I think there's meaning to be made within the hope, right? Like, I think about hoping as an action as opposed to, like, a goal. And so how to live in the hope, how to how to manifest hope as an action, as opposed to hope as a belief, right? As a type of faith that somehow things will get better, right? Which I absolutely disbelieve in, that things will just magically get better.
No.
But I can understand and strive for and really push towards a hope that is an action, that is like I believe in things getting better because I'm working towards it, because you know what I mean, like, and so that makes a lot more, that type of hope I can get down with. That I feel like yeah.
Yeah, man, I think that might be the perfect place to wrap up.
With me fumbling for words?
No, it's a beautiful sentiment. All right. And yeah, I really, really appreciate you taking the time, especially so late, and talking with me. I really had a great time. I hope you did too.
Yeah, absolutely.
Okay, as I mentioned at the top of the show, new episodes of The Poetry Gods are back on February 28th, so definitely check that out. You can follow that show on Twitter at The Poetry Gods, all one word. And do check out Jose's online poetry course at the Adirondack Center for Writing. If you want to follow Jose, you can follow him on Twitter at _José Olivarez. I'll put a link in the show notes for that. And that is our show. If you have any questions about today's episode, or really about anything, you can email me at podcast@keepthechanneleopen.com. You can follow me and the show on Twitter at ChannelOpenPod, or on Facebook at facebook.com/keepthechanneleopen. If you like this episode, please leave a review on iTunes. There's a link in the show notes for that, and it's a quick and free way that you can help boost the ranking of the show. If you want to go a little further in supporting the show, you can make a monthly pledge to our Patreon campaign, which is at patreon.com/sakeriver. That's sake like the drink and river like river. And if you want to stay up to date and never miss an episode, you can subscribe to the podcast via iTunes, Stitcher, SoundCloud, or your favorite podcast app. Our theme music is by Poddington Bear. You can find more of his music available for licensing at soundofpicture.com. Next time, our guest will be poet Hanif Willis Abdurraqib, so be sure to come back for that. Until then, remember, keep the channel open.